Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Cutting Room Floor. This is a segment where we get to dive a little deeper into some theme that's related to a recent message here at Sunny Slope Church. This past Sunday, we we focused on a challenging topic, and that is the topic of suffering. And the big picture of what we were looking at is how, for many people, the experience of suffering is evidence against the existence of God. In other words, if God really existed and if he was powerful, then he would put an end to suffering. He wouldn't allow it to happen. And you can go back and you can watch that message, and you can see and understand the full response to that there. For Christians, historically, Christians have understood that suffering plays an integral part of the Christian life. It's only been in recent years, I think, that Christians have seen suffering as something foreign to what it means to be a follower of Jesus. For many, many years, for centuries, in fact, dating right back to the origins of the early church in the first century, it was clearly understood that to become a Christian meant to embrace and walk in a way of suffering. 500 some odd years ago, John Calvin wrote about suffering at length in his Institutes, and I thought it would be maybe helpful and valuable to go back and revisit some of the things that Calvin says about suffering. Calvin talks about the Christian life as a life in which we are living under the cross. A life living under the cross, which is a way of saying that to become a Christian means to walk in a way of great sacrifice and great suffering. And some of that suffering and some of that affliction that we will experience as Christians is not only permitted to us by God, but it's even sent from God. Now, I think there's a distinction between sin and suffering. God does not author sin. God is not the author of sin, but he does permit suffering. He does allow us to suffer, and he uses it for his purposes. And Calvin actually points to 5 different ways that God is at work when we are living under the cross. And so I want to just go through these, and maybe for your own reflection and for your own encouragement, to help you see perhaps what God might be doing, because some of you today are suffering. Some of you are suffering with an illness, or a family member has an illness, or there's been a loss in your life, or you're facing adversity, you're facing hardship in your work, in your home, or in your school. And it's natural to question, what is God doing? We never want to be trite, and we never want to be simplistic. We never want to be reductionistic about this, which is a way of saying we always need to be sensitive to you might say, to the human component of this, and to the reality of the pain that is involved. But we also know as Christians that suffering is not meaningless. Living under the cross means that God is at work. The first thing Calvin says that living under the cross leads us to trust in God's power rather than our own. Let's face it, you and I, we like to believe that we are strong, that we are capable, that we can handle whatever comes in our way. And Calvin says that God can best restrain this arrogance when he proves to us by experience not only the great incapacity, but also the frailty under which we labor. Right? Suffering has this way of sort of stripping us of any illusions of power and strength that we have. Right? Suffering has this way of bringing us to the end of ourselves. And at that moment, when you are at the end of yourself, you have sort of a choice to make. Am I going to continue to trust in my own strength? Am I going to continue to try to do this in my own power and in my own ability? Or will I learn to rest in God's power? And Calvin says, living under the cross is an invitation and an opportunity to trust in the power of God. And then related to that, Calvin says, when we are living under the cross, it leads us to experience God's faithfulness. Living under the cross or facing adversity and hardship is never anything that we seek out. It's never something that we want. But what Calvin says is that by performing what he promises, he establishes his truth for time to come. What Calvin is saying there is that in the midst of adversity and in the midst of hardship, we begin to see that God is faithful. When you are lying in bed in a hospital room and you are alone, that's when God proves himself faithful and present with you. When you've lost your job and you aren't sure where to turn, and maybe God opens doors that you never imagined and he begins providing for you, those are the moments where you see that God is faithful to care for his people. When your marriage is falling apart and you come to the end of yourself and you trust in God's power, and God, perhaps in your case, he puts the marriage back together, God proves himself faithful. Or if the marriage doesn't get put back together, then in the midst of your loneliness and pain, then you begin to see that God is enough, right? God proves himself faithful. And then related to that, living under the cross, says Calvin, trains us to patience and obedience. It's pretty easy, I think, or at least relatively easy, to obey God when the cost is comparatively small. It's pretty easy to obey God when life is going the way that we want, when our prayers are being answered, when our finances are in really good shape, when we're surrounded by friends and loved ones and we aren't wanting for anything. It's pretty easy to be obedient to God. But what happens when we lose those things? You know, the story of Job in the Old Testament is the classic example. Job was faced with a dilemma. Do you trust in God when everything that is near and dear to you has been taken away? And of course, that's the whole tension and the conflict in the book. And we see that Job does remain faithful to God. He says, I will not sin even in the midst of this kind of hardship. And that is true for us as well. In the face of adversity, in the face of hardship, one of the questions that we're faced is, will I continue to obey God? Will I forgive that person who has hurt me so deeply? Because that's what God wants me to do. Or do we insist on holding a grudge because the hurt is too deep? And Calvin says that God wants to instruct us to obedience. He wants us to see what it's really like to obey God, even when it's costly. Because there are times when obedience will be costly. We're called to obey not just when it's easy, but also when it's difficult. Calvin, the fourth reason, so just by way of review, Calvin says that living under the cross leads us to trust in God's power, leads us to experience God's faithfulness. It trains us towards patience and obedience. Reason number 4, Calvin says that living under the cross is medicine. Calvin compares God to a physician, to a doctor, and sometimes he, as a good physician, God recognizes that there is sin and impurity in our life, and sometimes that needs to be cleansed from us. Sometimes the best way to do that is through adversity. The best way to do that is perhaps for God allowing the consequences of our sinful behavior to come to fruition. God might allow, he might not protect you from, say, the repercussions of an addiction. He might not prevent you from the consequences of your bitterness and your anger. He might allow that to come out. And these situations might be of our own making. We looked at this in the story of Joseph, where I suggested that some of the suffering was the result of human behavior, human sinfulness. And sometimes God allows this. And he does it not because he's malicious and not because he wants to inflict suffering on us, but as Calvin puts it, he cleanses others by harsher remedies while he wills to provide for the health of all. He yet leaves no one free and untouched. In other words, God uses suffering as a medicine, as a way of bringing healing, and sometimes that medicine is gentle and sometimes it's more harsh, but it's always for the purpose of healing. And then finally, Calvin says that living under the cross is fatherly chastisement. There are times when I think what Calvin is saying is that there are times when God wants us to live for the approval of our Father rather than for the approval of the world. Calvin, he puts it this way: he afflicts us not to ruin or destroy us, but rather to free us from the condemnation of the world. It's pretty easy at times to live for the approval and the acceptance of the world. We sometimes are drawn to building our lives on what this world values and holds near and dear. And so we pursue a life of wealth, or we pursue a life of pleasure or power or popularity. And in the process, God may look at this and he may see this and he may take it away. And sometimes that is painful. But what God is doing is, what Calvin is saying is that he's wanting us to learn to live for God. He wants our lives devoted to him. And sometimes the way to do that is to allow adversity in our lives to raise that question: where really is my loyalty? What really am I living for? And even at times, Calvin goes on and he sort of brings up a related point, which is there are times when God sees that we may be falling away. Some of you watching this, you've got family members, and that's what they're going through. They've turned their backs on the faith. They've turned their backs on God, and they've wandered away. What Calvin would say to this is, one of the things that God may do is he may chastise them. Now, that sounds harsh, but think about it this way. When God's children wander away from him, God does not give up on them. He still cares for them. And what God may do is allow them to experience hardship and pain and suffering in order to bring them back. All right, Calvin says, when we have fallen away from him, God destroys us unless by reproof he recalls us. Thus, he rightly says, and this is from Hebrews chapter 12, if we are without discipline, we are illegitimate children. And so sometimes God uses suffering to discipline us, to correct us. When we are his children, but we are living waywardly, or when we are doing things that are disobedient, God may use suffering as a means of correcting us. And when we are his children and wandering away, he may use suffering as a way to bring us back to himself. But in all things, God never gives up on his children. Now, no one wants suffering. And we ought not to, I think, go out running around looking to bring it into our lives. But the fact of the matter is that if we are serious about following Jesus, and if we live that commitment out, then we don't need to go looking for suffering. It will find us. Jesus, when he invites us to follow him, he says, if you want to be my disciple, you have to take up your cross, to take up a means of suffering, a means of rejection, or means of humiliation. That becomes part of who you are. That begins to define you. You deny yourself. You deny what you would naturally want and seek after and pursue in order to follow Jesus. In short, we embrace a life that is lived under the cross. But the good news is that Jesus redeems suffering to accomplish God's good purpose in our life. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time on the cutting room floor.